Well, welcome everybody. I'm very glad to see that some people are still ambulatory at the end of the long term and towards the end of another week. But I know you didn't come to see me. Anyway, a few announcements. My name is Michael Gertler. I am the Acting Director at the Center for the Study of Cooperatives. And this is another in a series of seminars that we at the Center like to have when we have a chance to feature a visiting scholar or someone on campus who's doing some research we'd like to share. And if you'd like to be signed up for the seminar series, if you're not already, we have a little sheet. I wanted to say that what brings John Restakis to campus here is partly a visit with us at the Center for the Study of Cooperatives, but partly he's in town because he's a featured speaker at a conference which is taking place mostly tomorrow, a joint production of the Saskatchewan Cooperative Association and the Saskatchewan Community Economic Development Network. And if anybody would like some information about that, I have that here. For some of you, John Restakis needs no introduction, but I don't want to assume that everybody has had a chance to meet him. And I'm going to take a few moments to introduce him. In his professional life, he's the executive director of the BC Co-op Association based in Vancouver. And in BC, there are 600 or 700 cooperatives, and many of them are part of his association. He's coming here mainly speaking about the work he's done on this book. And he very kindly bought some copies here. They're available in better bookstores everywhere, but and in our library.
Maybe that's why they're not selling. They're all...
It's my ethnic background. It's the wrong way. Anyway, the book is here. He's happy to autograph them with any appropriate acknowledgments. And he's going to talk about some of the work he did on in writing this book. It was the product of thinking for many years about what needed to be said, but also some intensive study that he did on a year's sabbatical traveling in Italy and in Sri Lanka and in India and among other places. John is a committed activist. And he was born in Athens, but grew up in Toronto, so he's a cosmopolitan in the best sense of the word. Locally rooted, but globally connected. He, at the age of 18, started working as a community organizer in Toronto's Riverdale area, joining the Greater Riverdale organization, which was at the time one of Canada's foremost direct action, community action organizations. He also did a stint in Chicago, training as a community organizer with the Industrial Areas Foundation, and then spent time in Quebec City and eventually in Southeast Asia in India, completing his own informal education. He returned to Toronto and became active in the parent movement as an organizer for school reform in the community relations. It's the School Community Relations Department of the Toronto Board of Education, and stayed there until they dissolved it. It had nothing to do with his presence, I think. But he went back to India to study, and he taught at the Rishi Valley School established by Krishnamurti. People will know who he is, some of you. Others will Google him. He returned to Canada to work as a popular educator and a trainer in adult literacy. And in the early 90s, he became active in the co-op movement in Ontario. For various reasons, some of them the ascension of Mike Harris to the provincial government leadership, and perhaps the weather in Toronto, he moved west and became the executive director of the BC Co-op Association, where he has been ever since. In addition to duties building the co-op movement in BC, he does consulting work on international co-op development projects. He researches and teaches on cooperative economies, the social economy, and globalization, and was and is a founding member of the advisory committee for the MA program in community development at the University of Victoria. He was also the co-founder and coordinator of the Bologna Summers program on co-ops in Italy at the University of Bologna, a project he hopes we will refloat one of these days soon. and so do many of our students. He earned his BA at the University of Toronto with a major degree in East Asian Studies, not cooperative studies, and a specialist studies in Sanskrit and classical Greek. He holds a master's degree in the philosophy of religion. And he has 2 other books to his name. One is called Storylines, Oral Histories for Literacy, published in 1987, and one called The Co-op Alternative, Civil Society and the Future of Public Services, published in 2001. Well, I've taken up too much of this time already. I'll turn over the mic to you. I will tell you one thing. We have elected, and this is the second time we're trying it, to video and tape record, of course, our seminars with the idea that they will eventually end up on YouTube. So those of you who have a strong allergy or reasons not to appear on television or on video, our cameraman will be actually not photographing you, although your questions will be recorded. But if you really don't want to be here, this is the time not to be here. Anyway, thank you very much, John, and we'll look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Michael. I have to smile when anybody refers to me as a scholar. I was going to, I don't feel like I am, and I'm not constrained by the conventions of scholarship, so I can sort of be far more opinionated than I would be if I were a scholar. I'm not going to give this in Sanskrit. I'll try English. But Michael was quite right. This book is a product of, quite a large number of years of reflecting on what I'd come to discover in connection to the co-op movement work that I've been doing over the last 15 or 16 years. And also feeling it was kind of an opportune time to try and gather my thoughts and put some structure to them and try and distill and crystallize some of the key ideas I'd been sort of reflecting on over the time I've been involved with the co-op movement here in Canada. So the subject then of this particular talk, and of course of the book as a whole, is called Humanizing the Economy. And it was interesting when I started the research on this and started the writing of it. I was actually in Italy, in a small hill town, really quite remote, and a small stone cottage in the fall of 2008, when all of the collapse of the Wall Street banks took place. So here I was thinking, how should I start this book off? And I turn on the television, and all this stuff is going on. So I remember very vividly sitting there in the heart of, the snow was coming in and the wind was blowing. There was nobody around for miles around. Really quite isolated, watching Al Jazeera and BBC report on the collapse of the Wall Street financial houses. So that's how I sort of began to frame the subject. And it was right on the mark because of the elements that I want to sort of talk about in this paper I'm going to share with you now. So it kind of, in a sense, was a key focal point for coming to grips with what I have come to believe now is the defining issue of our age. And that's the widening gap between economics on the one hand and the welfare of human societies on the other. It's a question that cuts across, I think, every major issue that daily comes in front of us and claims our attention. The growing disparity between rich and poor, the destruction of our environment, the decline of community, the rise of depression and the spread of unhappiness, and of course, the unraveling of our economies caused by institutionalized greed, capsulated in the events of 2008. So, the issues that I just identified are not new. All of us, or most of us, have known for a long time that our economic and political systems favor the rich and the powerful. And really, one would have to be quite asleep not to know this. But something has crystallized, I believe, in our lifetimes. Our lives, those of the generations that were born after the Second World War, have been the time span of a major transition in human society. A constellation of forces have converged and crystallized into a wholly new phenomenon. And that is what I call the final triumph of economic man, Homo Economicus. So this model of economic man as becoming the defining model for the individual and society. So the idea of Homo Economicus is the result of 200 years of history. And while this period has been a time of unprecedented growth and prosperity, in material wealth, the notion of the human individual as being defined primarily in economic terms as a consumer has also produced profound social and, I believe, psychological damage. And as a society, we're just now coming to terms with the consequences. The personal costs include depression, anxiety, and widespread unhappiness. Social costs, such as the decline of social relationships that are the bedrock of community, are also at crisis points. So how has this happened? At the bottom of all this is what I call the grand delusion. What is the grand delusion? It's the belief that the economy is divorced from society. It's a belief in a so-called free market that floats above actual societies and actual people and somehow operates according to its own laws, separate from the social relationships that underpin virtually every other human activity. In the grand delusion, economies operate according to their own natural laws with little or no connection to the societies that produce them, like gravity or chemistry. In short, economies have been dehumanized while humans have been economized. I'm not sure that's the right term, but you get the point. So this is one aspect of what I mean when I speak about humanizing the economy, the absolute necessity of situating economics within the context of social reality. But this is not new. It sounds like common sense when you say it, but the notion of an autonomous, a self-regulating economy is central to the theory and practice of mainstream economics. It dominates most departments of economics. It is taught as a first principle in textbooks. But the idea is not only bizarre, it's also very recent. It was during the 1800s and the rise of industrial capitalism that the notion of the free market came into vogue. Before this, throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, even up to the middle 1800s, economies and markets were understood to be an extension of the societies in which they operated. Markets were carefully monitored and controlled. The notion that a market was free, in the sense that social or political forces had no role to play in their operation, would have been incomprehensible. It wasn't until the 1800s, in fact, that the pursuit of profit was identified as a defining feature of markets. Before this, markets were understood to have a clear social purpose, which included the idea that prices should be fair and transparent, that monopolies should be avoided, and that products had to meet standards for quality. And if the creation of profit was accepted as one aspect of economies, it was only one among others. So, for example, reciprocity and mutual aid have always been a part of how economies actually work. Sharing and redistribution were also essential to economic systems, and they continue to be. They are major, although unrecognized, aspects of our own economy. So I'll come back to this point later, but the idea that the sole purpose of an enterprise or of an economy is to maximize profits to shareholders would have been considered insane in any time before our own. So, in the history of bad ideas, with huge consequences, the idea of the free market is one of the worst, in my opinion. So what have been some of the results of this idea? I've already said that the rise of the idea of the free market coincided with the rise of prosperity and productivity in those societies where it took root. So I don't want to minimize the fact that the revolution that took place with respect to how markets came to be understood and organized also produced enormous benefits. The question I am raising is, at what cost? And have we arrived at a point where what we considered benefits in one time and context have become toxic today? I would also argue that another revolutionary idea that arose around the same time was at least as responsible for the rise in prosperity as that of the free market. And that's the idea of democracy. So, the idea of democracy. This is borne out by the fact that the level of prosperity in a society appears to be directly proportional to the democratic distribution of power. Conversely, the level of privilege and economic disparity in a society is proportional to its absence, the absence of democracy. So, contrary to what some would have us believe, it is not free markets and capitalism that are the preconditions of democracy. Democracy has been around since the 4th century BC. I would argue that it is democracy that is a precondition for prosperity and, to a large extent, capitalism itself. Why is this? It's because economies are a mirror reflection of a society's politics. Economic power and political power are twin forces. If you have one, you have the other. And chances are, if you lack one, you also lack the other. In both cases, in economics, just as in politics, there is only one remedy to privilege, and that is the redistribution of power as widely as possible. So, when the democratic revolutions of the 18th century forced the sharing of power in politics, one immediate consequence was the rise in prosperity. It was democracy that made possible the creation of social security systems, of minimum wages and work safety, of universal health, and of universal education. These are things that many of us now take for granted. Look what is happening now in the revolutions sweeping the Arab world, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, and the rest of the Arab world. The demand for democracy is intimately linked to the absence of economic opportunity. People understand that political freedom is the basis of prosperity. And that's just the beginning. Throughout the West, hard-won gains, such as social welfare and even collective bargaining in the United States, are now at risk because the democratic idea that transformed political power didn't go far enough. It was stopped at the doorstep of economics. What was good for politics was somehow bad for economics. And it was at this time, around 1860, that notions of the free market became an article of faith for economists and politicians. And I don't think it was a coincidence. It was also at this time that the first experiments with economic democracy began to flourish with the rise of the cooperative movement in England. Rochdale, one of the first truly successful modern cooperatives, was established just before Christmas in 1844. It was a co-op started by a group of weavers and cobblers with a total capital outlay of £28 sterling. It took the 28 founding members 4 months to raise the money. By the 1880s, there were thousands of cooperative societies in England and across Europe, and the co-op principle, one member, one vote, was the first time that the democratic idea was applied to economics on a mass scale through the creation of democratic enterprises. And it was also the first time that a truly comprehensive vision for an alternative society and economy was advanced in response to the capitalism of that time. So in England, where the co-op movement began, these cooperatives were created as a response to the massive unemployment and the high cost of basic goods that were one result of the Industrial Revolution. But they were more than that. They were a conscious attempt to protect the social purpose of economics. Cooperatives were seen as a way of utilizing the market to meet social ends that benefited everyone, not just the privileged few. At its visionary height, just before the turn of the century, the cooperative movement was the first real alternative to the free market idea of economics as the preserve of capital. It was the first attempt to create a social market in the industrial era. What I want to stress is that democracy and the co-op form remain keys to rehumanizing our economies today. This doesn't mean going back to some pre-modern form of society where markets and economies, although highly social, were also very limited in their capacity to produce more than basic subsistence life for most people. It does mean taking the democratic revolution beyond politics into economics so that it can transform economies as it once transformed political systems. This isn't just a question of restoring a sense of social justice and humanity in our economic systems. It is also a question of saving the democratic idea inside our political systems. The absence of democracy in our economies has resulted in the corrosion and corruption of our politics. A little over a year ago, in the United States, the Supreme Court legalized this fact by its decision to grant corporations unlimited powers to buy elections. In Canada, the Harper government has been trying, and so far failing, to repeal public financing of elections. What I'm saying is that while we are still nominally citizens in politics, we remain subjects in the marketplace. And that is just how the powers that be would like to keep it. So, the alleged affinity between democracy and capitalism is contradicted both by the historical record and by the conduct of our economic institutions. This is most obvious in suppression of democracy inside the marketplace. The inequity of political power that allowed ruling elites to exploit the weak in pre-democratic societies is the same issue at work today in the realm of economics. The freedom and equality that were won at such cost in politics through the democratic revolutions have been steadily eroded by the pervasive and growing influence of corporate power in our economies. In any society, authoritarian power in economics ultimately trumps democratic power in politics. The absence of democracy in economics is a permanent threat to the survival of democracy in politics. The human striving for equality and dignity that lay at the foundation of the democratic impulse was derailed in its extension to economics just when it was most needed, when the power of capital and the property-owning classes was consolidated during the period of the Industrial Revolution. But there has never been a convincing answer to the question, if democracy is good for politics, why is it not equally good for economics? After all, the operations of the economy and the connection that people have with its institutions on a daily basis have a far more profound impact on the quality and conduct of our daily lives than almost anything else. We exercise our democratic right to vote for public officials once every 3 or 4 years. Yet we spend most of our waking hours in our workplaces, most of which are still run like tyrannies, day in and day out. So I ask, how is it that a free market is run along authoritarian systems of command and control and personified by tyrannical models of power in the individual firm? It's a contradiction so basic a child could see it, and one that free market mythology cannot resolve. If markets should be free, they must also be free in their institutions. So, what is very clear is that the market and the larger notion of the economy of which it is a part is in its nature a social and a public concept. The notion that any one class can own the market or that the market has a natural organizational form, such as the corporation, are false. And despite the assumptions of free market proponents, the market does not belong to capital. The forms of enterprise that make it up and give it its vitality are as varied as the uses to which they are put and the values that they embody. These values may be just as committed to social ends as they are to commercial ones. The forms that capitalism take are also very diverse. Conventional economics make it sound as if true capitalism comes in just this one pure form of the free market populated by private companies. This is also false, and it contradicts one of capitalism's greatest strengths, its chameleon-like ability to adapt. There are many capitalisms, many ways that capital can mobilize and coordinate the process of economic production. So, what has been buried from view this last 2 centuries and more are the uses of the market for the pursuit of social ends. It is only now, in fact, that the hidden history of the social economy is coming back into the light. What I mean by the social economy is all those types of associations, like cooperatives, nonprofits, and voluntary associations, whose economic activities are used to pursue social ends. So in British Columbia, where I live, there are 24,000 nonprofits, 10,000 charitable organizations, and over 650 co-ops. They include credit unions, consumer co-ops, and the whole gamut as we have here in Saskatchewan. So nonprofits alone in BC generate $11 billion in revenue every year and employ 147,000 people. So this is almost the size of BC's manufacturing sector. In Canada, social economy is one of the biggest in the world, with more than 161,000 charities and not-for-profit organizations, 8,000 cooperatives. It accounts for 7.1% of the national economy. So the sector is also key in doing the work that might otherwise be done by government. In 2009, Canada's social economy carried out more than $3 billion worth of federal programs. So aside from ignoring a major part of the economy, the exclusion of society from the development of economic theory has had lasting and deeply damaging effects. Society's survival response to what I consider just the plain idiocy of the autonomous market doctrine asserted itself from the first attempts to enforce market logic on human systems. And the struggle continues to this day. The great experiments in socialism and cooperativism, the emergence of trade unions, and the battle for democratic rights in economics as well as in politics were all part of this human response to an inhuman system. They appeared at the very dawn of the machine age. The forms of the struggle evolved in our own industrial societies, but the types of resistance and reform that are now taking place in developing countries mirror the social and collectivist models that arose in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. The key dynamic of Western history since the rise of the machine age has been a double motion: the attempt to subject society to the mechanisms of the market system, and the corresponding responses by society to defend itself against the damages wrought by this system. And now, with the spread of global capitalism, this same dynamic is being played out on a global stage. In our time, the issues arising from the domination of market logic in Western society are different. They have become subtler, more complex, and more difficult to perceive because the problems today are as much questions of ideology and the patterns of popular consciousness as they are of material welfare. Any solution or alternative to free market capitalism has to contend with these non-material, and I would say even spiritual, realities. One crucial question is the submersion of our social identities that is bound up in the idea of economic man. This has created two contradictory realities in the human experience. The first is the growth of material wealth to a scale beyond anything in any age before us. It's the crowning achievement of capitalism in all its forms. The second has been the spiritual and social poverty and the profound sense of unhappiness and longing that has become a defining feature of modern civilization. This is the great paradox of our age, the happiness paradox. It would appear that such unhappiness and the illusions on which it rests is the psychic price that must be paid for the type of wealth we have created. Our social poverty shows up in the minds of those who, like Margaret Thatcher, truly believe that society is a fiction and consists of nothing more than a collection of individuals. But it is most apparent in the difficulty people have in imagining any alternative to the present system. This inability to imagine an alternative is the final triumph of ideology. The enthronement of consumerism and the acceptance of corporate capitalism as its social mechanism have diminished public life, denying people everywhere insight into other ways of organizing and conceiving life. It is here that the most difficult, the most necessary work must be done to advance a more fully human vision of what economies might be and how such economies might be constructed. Alternatives do exist. The effort to humanize economies has been attempted since the dawn of the industrial age. And the impact of these attempts has been the only thing that has made capitalism and our own market system more humane. Because the task has been not only to construct a more humane alternative to the free market model, but also to humanize the model we have. All these efforts, embodying the idea of communalism in some form, reflect the attempt to transcend the self-regulating market by subordinating it to the needs of society through democratic means. I argue that the most enduring and most promising of these efforts is the use of cooperation. There are others, but what is essential in all of them is the notion that our economies can be used for social as well as private ends, and that our forms of economic association, be they co-ops or nonprofits or social enterprises, can be built around the notion that each of us can benefit individually when we work together around shared goals. Reciprocity, the idea that if I help you, you will in turn help me, is essential to the social dimension of economics. It is the foundation of what we call social capital. And the more we create and use such institutions, the more we will restore the sense of social connection that is undermined by free market individualism. It isn't magic. It isn't complicated. It's simply the recognition that rehumanizing our economies means reclaiming the social purpose of economics. By doing so, by understanding that our own fortunes are bound up in the well-being of others, we both affirm and restore a more fully human conception of ourselves, not merely as consumers or as competing individuals, but as social beings. Thank you.